The town calls her cursed. And the cowboy, who bought her last vase for $1, has no idea he just bought a letter he was never meant to read. She was a Chinese potter down to her final piece, and her brother was burning with a fever the herbs couldn't break. He took the vase home to an empty ranch and didn't look at it again for weeks, until the base turned in his hand and a hollow opened where no hollow should be. Inside was a letter in her hand, and it told him everything the town had refused to see. Stay until the end to hear the 4 words he whispered to a woman the whole town had written off as gone. Redstone sat in a basin between 2 ridgelines in Wyoming territory, the kind of town that exists because somebody ran out of reasons to keep moving. 3 saloons lined the main street, their signs faded to the color of old whiskey, and a general store with a crooked door sold everything from flour to nails. The year was 1884, and the territory was still mean to the people it needed most. The trading post ran on kerosene lanterns that threw an amber jumping light across the shelves, and that light made everything in the room look half-decided. Jeanne stood at the counter with one vase set between her hands, and the light caught the blue under the glaze in a way that made the painted cranes seem to move. End quote. She was dressed like someone who worked clay for a living. A rough indigo wrap and a plain cloth over her hair, with her hands stained gray-white to the wrist from the kiln, and she should have looked ordinary in a room full of ranchers and teamsters. She didn't. She stood completely still in the middle of the noise, her dark eyes fixed on the storekeeper the way a person watches a door they expect something bad to walk through. The vase was the last piece from her father's clay, thrown on a wheel he built before he died on the crossing, painted with the cobalt he taught her to grind, and fired in a kiln she hadn't been able to heat in a month. It was the only thing she had left to sell, and her brother was 3 days into a fever. The herbs wouldn't break. The storekeeper was a red-faced man named Pruitt, and he held the vase up to the lantern the way a man holds a thing he's already decided to steal. He turned it once, ran his thumb along the rim, and set it back down without meeting her eyes. He offered her 40 cents, then 50, and the room went quiet the way a room goes quiet when it's waiting to see how much it can take from someone who can't afford to lose. She didn't argue. She held the price she'd named in her head, $1, because that was what the willow bark and the rice would cost to keep Bo alive 1 more week. Pruitt shook his head and said the glaze was uneven, and the base was rough, and the men behind her laughed the low laugh of men who like to watch a woman get smaller. The prejudice wasn't in anything he said. It was in the silence of the 9 people standing there, none of whom would look at her, and all of whom would have paid $2 for the same vase from a white hand. Nash was already in the store, buying rope and salt for the line camp, and he'd been watching from the nail counter without meaning to. He was a tall man who kept to himself 3 miles out, built his place post by post, after he buried his wife and the infant they'd had for 11 days, and he didn't talk about that to anyone. He didn't know her name, didn't know about the brother, or the kiln, or the letter, sealed inside the base. All he knew was that a room was about to take a vase from a woman who couldn't afford to lose it, and he hated that kind of room the way a man hates weather that drowns stock. He walked to the counter, set a silver dollar down next to the vase, and told Pruitt to wrap it without haggling, without looking at the men, without making a speech about fairness. He picked up the wrapped vase, nodded once at Jen without quite meeting her eyes, and walked out into the cold. It wasn't kindness the way the town would have called kindness. It was the cost of leaving a room he couldn't stand to stay in, paid in, the only coin the room understood. All. She watched him go, and her face showed nothing. Not relief, not gratitude, just the controlled stillness of someone who had already survived worse than anything this room could do to her. The dollar bought the willow bark and the rice and a handful of dried ginger, and she walked the 3 miles back to the creekside shack with the weight of the empty space where the vase had been. She didn't know the man's name either, only that her brother would eat one more week, and that the last thing her father's hands had made was sitting on a stranger's shelf. Her father had been a potter in a long line of potters, men and women who worked the wheel in a town the world called the porcelain capital, where the kilns ran night and day, and the cobalt went on gray and turned blue only in the fire. He crossed to the west with his wife and 2 children, because the old country was closing its doors, and the frontier promised a place where a man's hands weren't a crime. He died of a flux on the trail before they reached the coast, and Zen buried him in a shallow grave and carried the wheel and the cobalt and the knowledge the rest of the way alone. She set up the wheel in the creekside shack the first winter, and she threw the way he taught her, centering the clay with the heel of her hand, drawing the walls up slow, letting the clay find its own height. The blue and white came from cobalt ground, fine, and mixed with water, painted onto the clay while it was still leather hard, before the glaze, before the fire. The trick her father hammered into her was that the color was a lie until the kiln called it out, and you had to paint blind, trusting the heat to finish what your hands started. The vase Nash bought was the last of her father's clay, the last batch she'd brought across, and she'd painted the cranes from a memory of a scroll her mother kept. She sealed something inside the base before the final firing, the way her father sealed a letter for the kiln god in every piece he sent to the fire, a habit he called a prayer and she called a record. She told Bo was a letter for the kiln god, and Bo, burning even then, didn't ask what it said, and she didn't tell him she'd written the truth of their crossing in it, the things she would never be allowed to say standing in a room like Pruitt's. Badiou was 18. The youngest the law allowed her to keep, and he'd been her hands when the fever took her strength, hauling water, splitting wood, selling her bowls at the general store for what the town would pay a Chinese boy. The fever came on slow, a heat that wouldn't settle, then a cough that deepened into a rattle, and the herbs she knew, the ginger root and the willow bark and the cupping she'd learned from her grandmother, weren't enough to pull him back. The doctor in town wouldn't cross the creek to the Chinese side, and the priest would come only to pray, not to doctor. She tried everything the old ways gave her. She boiled ginger root and pressed the steam to his chest, set the cupping glass along his lungs to draw the heat out, packed a poultice of crushed willow bark against his throat, and spooned congee into him, a thimble at a time. The fever climbed anyway. By the 3rd day, his skin was dry, and his breathing came in long, shallow pulls, and she sat beside him on the dirt floor, and understood that the herbs had run their course and the money had run out at the same time. The decision came the way hard decisions come, not as a moment, but as a wall she'd been walking toward for weeks. She could let the vase sit on the shelf and watch her brother stop breathing, or she could carry it into town and trade the last of her father's hands for one more week of her brother's life. The cost wasn't the dollar, it was the only proof left that her family had been real, and had made things with their hands, and had crossed an ocean for a reason that still meant something. She wrapped the vase in a cloth, kissed Bo's burning forehead, and walked into town before the sun was up, and she didn't cry. And she didn't hesitate at the door, because the women in her line didn't break where anyone could see. She set the vase on Pruitt's counter and named her price, and when the room tried to take it for less, a stranger paid the dollar and walked out, and she let the last piece of her father go. Nash rode the 3 miles home, with the vase wrapped in his saddlebag, and the cold came off the basin, in sheets that made the horses stamp. He didn't think about the woman in the store, or the brother she'd mentioned to Pruitt, in a voice low enough that the room pretended not to hear. He thought about the salt, and the rope, and the fence line he had to mend, before the first real snow, and the long winter of work that was the only thing between him and the quiet of the house. The broken spur sat 3 miles out of Redstone on purpose, The way a man chooses which side of a river to camp on, because what's on the other side has the potential to drown him. He'd built the ranch himself, post by post, in the year after the fever took his wife Clara, and the infant they'd only had for 11 days. And he'd chosen the distance the same way he chose everything, to keep the world from getting close enough to take another thing. He didn't talk about Clara. And he didn't talk about the baby. And he didn't keep a second chair at the table, because there was no one to sit in it. He ran cattle alone on 160 acres. He'd paid for in sweat, and the work was the kind that filled a man's hands so full, his mind couldn't get at him. He was up before the light, down after dark, and the days ran into each other the way water runs over stone, smooth and without marks. The hands in town called him cold, and the women called him a waste, and he let them, because being called cold was cheaper than being known. He set the vase on the shelf by the front window when he got home, still in its cloth, and he didn't unwrap it for 2 days. When he finally did, he turned it once in the lantern light, saw the cranes painted in a blue that seemed to sit under glass, and set it back on the shelf without a second look. He didn't know anything about pottery, and he didn't want to. The vase he'd bought was a thing he'd paid for only because a room was about to steal from a woman who couldn't afford to lose. And the dollar was the cheapest price he'd ever paid to leave a place with his own respect intact. The weeks passed, and the dust settled on the blue. He didn't clean the vase, didn't move it, didn't look at it when he passed the window. It sat there the way Clara's sewing box had sat in the corner for 3 years, a thing he kept because throwing it out would mean admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. The house ran on routine, coffee for one. The door, locked out of habit though no one came. The second hook, in the entryway holding nothing but air. He lived the way a man lives when he's decided the best part of his life is already over, and the rest is just finishing the work. His loneliness wasn't a feeling he'd have named. It was in the objects. The chair he never sat in, the plate he never set across the table, the way he ate standing at the counter more nights than he ate sitting down. He didn't drink, didn't go to town except for supplies, and the only voice he heard most weeks was his own giving the horses their orders. He'd made the solitude himself, post by post, the same way he'd made the ranch, and he'd made it to last, because the alternative was letting the world close enough to take another thing, and he'd already given it the 2 things he'd loved most. The vase stayed on the shelf through the first snow, and the blue cranes gathered dust, and Nash didn't know that the base of the thing he wouldn't look at held a letter that knew his name before he did. He didn't know the woman who'd made was about to lose the roof over her brother's head, or that the dollar he'd set on the counter was the only thing standing between her and a trail she might not come back from. He only knew the fence needed mending, and the wood needed splitting, and the winter was going to be long, and that the quiet of the house was the kind that gets heavier the longer you sit in it. The storm came in 3 days early, and stayed, the kind of blizzard that turns a man's house into a box, and makes him count the hours by the lantern oil he has left. Nash was 3 days indoors, before he ran out of the small work that fills a man's hands, and on the 3rd night, the quiet got close enough to make him restless. He lit the kerosene lamp, moved through the house, looking for something to do, and stopped at the window shelf where the vase had sat gathering dust for a month. He picked it up to wipe the shelf, and the weight was wrong. The walls were thin, the kind of thin that comes from a hand that knows how to draw clay up without tearing it, but the base had a heft the walls didn't explain. He turned it in his hands, ran his thumb along the bottom, and felt a seam where there should have been 1 piece of clay. The base was a second piece, fitted dry, no glue, seated by its own weight the way a good mason seats a stone, each part keeping its original shape. It was a trick he'd never seen in pottery, and it was the kind of trick that meant someone had put it there on purpose. He worked the base loose with the tip of his belt knife. Slow, the way a man works a thing he's afraid to break. The base came free with a soft click, and a hollow opened, where no hollow should be, a space the size of his fist, lined with unglazed clay. Inside, rolled tight and sealed with a drop of wax, was a letter. He pulled it out, held it to the lantern, and saw rows of characters in a hand he couldn't read, brushed in black ink on paper that had browned at the edges from the fire. He sat with it for a long time, not knowing what the letter said, or why a woman would hide words inside a vase she was selling for $1, and the not knowing sat in him heavier than the knowing would have. The letter went back into its wax, the base back into place, and he didn't sleep that night for thinking about the woman in the store and the look on her face when he'd set the coin down. He told himself it wasn't his business, that a man who bought a vase didn't owe the woman who sold it, and the argument held for about a mile of the ride home before it broke the way a bad fence breaks. All at once, and from the side he wasn't watching. At first, light he rode into town, with the Vase in his saddlebag, and went straight to the one man he knew who could read it. Old Chen kept a dry goods counter at the back of the livery, a man who'd crossed the same ocean Zen's father had crossed, and who kept his head down in Redstone, the way a man keeps his head down in a town that tolerates him for his usefulness. Nash set the vase on Chen's counter, worked the base loose again, and handed him the letter without a word. Chen read it once to himself, then again aloud, halting, in a voice that got quieter as he went. The letter gave her name, Zhen, and her father's name, and the town he'd come from, and the crossing, and the grave on the trail. It gave the brother, Bo, and the fever, and the herbs failing, and the line that said she was selling the last of her father's hands to buy her brother one more week. And it gave one line Chen read twice, the line that broke Nash open, the line that said she didn't ask for help, that she wrote only what she would never be allowed to say standing in a room like Pruitt's. Nash sat on a nail keg in the livery, and didn't move for a long time. Chen watched him, then told him the rest, the part the letter didn't say. The landlord had taken the creekside shack 2 days after the sale, because Zen couldn't pay, and she wouldn't beg. She'd loaded Bo into a buckboard in the middle of the night, taken the wheel and whatever clay she could carry, and headed east on the trail, toward a town where no one knew her yet. Chen didn't know if she'd made it, or if the boy was still alive, and his face said he didn't expect her to. Nash rode home, put the letter on the table, and looked at it under the lamp until the oil burned low. He didn't know what he was going to do, only that he couldn't sit in his house and let the letter be the last thing that came of her. He saddled up again at dawn. He rode back into Redstone, asking questions no white man asked about a Chinese woman, and the town read it, the way the town reads anything it doesn't understand, half as strange and half as dangerous, and he didn't care. He went to the livery first, then the general store, then the church, then the laundry at the edge of town, and he asked the same thing at every door, where she'd gone, and whether the boy was still breathing. The picture came in pieces, the way a picture always comes when a person is trying not to be found. A liveryman had seen her pull a buckboard out of the creekside camp after midnight, a small figure on the seat and a smaller one wrapped in blankets in the bed. The priest had given her a wool blanket and a name. The next town east, a day's ride, a place called Cedar Hollow, where the railroad still hired Chinese hands, and a man might rent a shack to a woman who didn't ask for charity. Someone at the laundry had slipped her a sack of rice and a handful of dried herbs the day before she left, and had cried after, though she wouldn't say why. The trail east ran through country that didn't forgive a light load. The buckboard was a work wagon, the kind built to haul feed and fence posts, not to carry a sick boy and a woman who hadn't slept, and the road climbed out of the basin through a pass that the storm had filled with drift. Nash had ridden that pass in the spring, and knew what it did to a team in good weather, and he thought about her up there alone, with one mule and a boy who couldn't hold the seat, and the thinking sat in him heavier than the cold. Danche, Nash put the pieces in order and saw the shape of her leaving. She'd gone because the landlord took the shack, and she wouldn't beg. And she'd gone in the night because the day would have meant looking people in the eye who would have watched her go without helping. She'd taken the wheel, the clay, the brother, and nothing else, and she'd headed east into a country that didn't want her, in a buckboard too light for the road, with a boy too sick to sit up. He caught his own prejudice on the way a man catches a splinter he didn't know was there. The assumptions came one on top of another, that she'd want to be found when everything she'd done said she'd chosen not to be, that she'd take his help when the letter said the one thing she wouldn't do was ask, that $1 and a ride fixed anything when the letter said $1 was the price of 1 week and the week was already gone, and he didn't say any of this out loud, because saying it would have made it a speech, and he wasn't the kind of man who made speeches. The survival tension came on the second day from a rider heading west who'd passed a buckboard stopped on the trail near a rock overhang. The rider said he'd seen a woman building a fire under the lean of the rock, and a boy wrapped in blankets who didn't sit up when the horses went by, and that he'd shouted something at the overhang and ridden on. Nash didn't ask what he'd shouted. He turned east and rode hard, and the cold came up off the basin, and the light went early, and he made the overhang just as the dark set in. He found them off the trail, under a shelf of sandstone, the buckboard unhitched, and the mule tied to a juniper, a small fire built from scrub and broken crate, and Jen kneeling over her brother with a poultice in her hands. Bado was burning, his skin dry and his breathing shallow, and he didn't open his eyes when the horse stopped. She looked up, saw Nash, and didn't flinch. She didn't thank him, and she didn't cry, and the first thing she said was to ask what he wanted. Nash didn't answer right away, because answering would have been a speech, and she'd asked a question that deserved a true thing, not a kind one. He did the only useful thing he could think of, which was to dismount, build up the fire, set a pot of snow to melt, and hold the lantern where she could see to work. He watched her hands as she laid the crushed willow bark along Bo's throat, drew the heat out with the cupping glass set along his ribs, and held the cloth, steeped in ginger steam, close to his face. In it, he saw the craft he'd seen in the vase, the hands of a person who'd been taught by someone who knew, doing the work the way the work was meant to be done. She didn't speak to him for the first hour, and he didn't force it. He fed the fire heated water when she nodded at the pot, and held the lantern steady when her hands needed both of them. The overhang was cold. The wind cut under the rock, and the boy's breathing was the only sound for long stretches, shallow pulls that made the blankets rise and fall in a rhythm that didn't sound like a rhythm that would last. Nash understood, watching, that she'd been doing this alone for days, on a trail, in the cold, with no doctor and no roof, and that the only thing keeping the boy alive was the steady weight of her hands. The near disaster came in the middle of the night, when a rider passed on the trail and shouted something at the overhang. A word Nash couldn't make out but whose shape he knew. "Tai" and "a Stan." He stood up, walked to the edge of the firelight and stood between the voice and the rock until the rider moved on. Nothing came of it. But it showed him what her life on the trail was, the way a shout out of the dark could become a threat or a joke or a warning, and she'd never know which until it was too late to do anything about it. It showed him what his presence had briefly changed, which was that there was a man standing in the light now, and the dark had to reckon with that before it got to her. By dawn the fever broke. Not because of Nash, and he knew it, and he made sure his face didn't claim any part of it. It broke because of her, and the rice the laundry woman had given her, and the 3 days she wouldn't sleep, and the willow bark, and the ginger, and the cupping she'd done by lantern light, with hands that didn't shake. Bo opened his eyes at first light, looked at his sister, and asked for water. And the sound of his voice was the first easy thing the overhang had held all night. Nash heated the water, handed her the cup, and let her be the one to put it to her brother's mouth. They sat after, the three of them, in the thin morning sun. And the quiet between them was the first quiet Nash had sat in for years. That didn't feel like a grave. She looked at him across the fire, and her face still showed nothing but the controlled stillness. And he understood that she was waiting to hear why he'd come, and that she wouldn't stay for kindness alone. He owed her the true thing, and he owed it to her in plain words, and he owed it before the sun got high enough to make the road look easy. Nash said it plain, the way he said everything, without softening it, and without making it bigger than it was. He had land, an empty house, a barn he didn't use, and a winter coming that he didn't want to sit through alone again, while she had a wheel, a knowledge of clay and fire, and a brother who needed a roof and a stove until the spring. He wasn't asking her to marry him, or to owe him, only to use his land, to do the thing her father taught her, and to let the house have a second chair that someone sat in. She didn't answer for a long time, and he didn't rush her, because rushing a woman like that would have been the same as not asking. When she spoke, it wasn't gratitude, it was terms. The way a person sets terms when she's learned that anything given without terms gets taken back. She'd build the kiln, she said, and fire her own work, and sell what she made, and keep what she earned, cook, doctor, the hands he cut on fence wire, and teach Bo the wheel so the line didn't end with her. The terms she wouldn't bend on were these. She wouldn't be a kept woman, and she wouldn't be a debt. And if he ever used the dollar against her, she and Bo would walk. Nash agreed to every term as she laid them, and he didn't bargain, because bargaining with a woman who'd just named her price would have been the same thing Pruitt had done. He added one term of his own, which was that she ate at the table, not in the kitchen, and that Bo ate at the table too. She looked at him a long moment, then nodded once, the kind of nod that's a signature, and the deal was made the way the best deals are made, with each side giving the other the one thing the other couldn't make alone. The partnership was built on mutual need and respect, not on romance, and neither of them called it love, because it wasn't yet, and they both knew the difference. He needed the house to stop being a grave he walked through, and he needed a reason to set a second plate. She needed a kiln and a roof, and a place where the town couldn't take the shack out from under her, and she needed it without strings that would turn her into something she'd crossed an ocean not to be. Neither said the word love, and neither needed to, because the work they were agreeing to do together was a truer thing than the word would have been. She asked him one more thing before they broke camp, which was why he'd come at all, and Nash gave her the only honest answer he had. He told her about the base of the vase, and the hollow, and the letter, and the old man who'd read it aloud in the back of the livery. He told her he'd sat with the letter under the lamp until the oil burned low, and that he hadn't been able to let it be the last thing that came of her. She listened without moving, and when he was done, she said that the letter wasn't for him, that it was for the kiln god, and that her father had taught her to put the truth of a piece inside the piece so the fire would know what it was carrying. Then she said she was glad the fire had sent it to him instead, and that was the closest thing to thanks she would give, and he took it as enough. They broke camp as the sun cleared the ridge, loaded the buckboard, and pointed the mule west toward the broken spur. Bado sat, wrapped in the blankets, in the bed of the buckboard, weak but awake, and Jen drove, while Nash rode ahead, to clear the trail of the snowdrifts the storm had left. They didn't talk much on the ride, because the terms were set, and the talking was done, and the rest was work, which was the part both of them were best at. Winter set in hard, and Jen built the kiln in the lee of the barn, from river stone, and creek clay. The way her father's line taught. Smaller than the kilns of the porcelain capital, but enough for her. She threw again, the first time in a month, and Nash watched from the doorway as she centered the clay with the heel of her hand and drew the walls up slow, the wheel turning under a foot treadle she dragged from a broken plow. Toe. She painted the cobalt on the leather-hard clay, gray-black, knowing it would turn blue only in the fire, and the knowing was the part her father had hammered into her, the trust that the heat would finish what the hands started. The first firing took 2 days, and Nash kept the fire fed through the night without being asked, banking the coals, splitting kindling, watching the draft. He didn't understand the kiln, but he understood fire. And he understood that a man who keeps a fire through the night for a woman's work is doing the same thing she's doing, which is trusting the heat to call something out of the dark. When she opened the kiln at dawn, the blue was there, under the clear glaze, the color that only the fire can call out. And she held the first bowl up to the snowlight and said nothing, because the blue said it for her. The town heard, the way towns hear, through the ranch wife, who came to the door with a cracked pot, then the one who came with a sick child, then the man who'd laughed in Pruitt's store, and now stood on the porch holding his hat. What reversed the prejudice was her hands, not a speech, because she never made one. She doctored the child with ginger and willow bark, set the cracked pot with a mend that held, and took payment in eggs and flour, and a sack of coal. The room that wouldn't pay her $1 now lined up at the door of the man who had, and the irony of it was, the one thing she never pointed out. Pruitt came himself, late in the winter, with a bowl his wife had bought in Denver, and a question about whether Zen could match the pattern. She looked at the bowl, turned it once, and told him she could do better, and she did, and he paid her $4 for it without a word about the glaze. Nash watched the storekeeper walk back down the drive with the bowl wrapped under his arm, and he thought about the day in the store, the room that had gone quiet to watch a woman get smaller, and the $1 that had been the cheapest and the dearest thing he'd ever spent. Nash watched from the porch as the line formed. And the house had a second chair now. And someone sat in it. Bado grew strong through the winter, learned the wheel, and threw his first bowl by the spring, lopsided and proud, the way a boy's first bowl always is. The kiln ran once a month through the cold, and the blue came out of it every time, and the cranes her father had painted from memory came back in her hands, on bowls and jars, and the base of a new vase she set on the shelf where the old one had been. The 4 words came on the night of the first firing, not as a rescue, but as a recognition, and Nash said them first to himself, standing in the cold watching the kiln glow, and then to her, quiet at the table, after she'd set the first bowl down between them. He said, "God sent you to me." She didn't answer with the same words, because she didn't talk that way, and she didn't owe him the same language he'd given her. She answered with what she did the next morning, which was to set a second bowl at his place, start the wheel, and begin the work of the next firing. The wheel turns, the cobalt goes on gray, and somewhere a kiln waits to call the blue out of the dark. If it moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city, so I can see how far this story travels.